It is wonderful to see you all here tonight. I know it's a hot day, and hopefully it's cool in here. And it's a hot topic, so I think that's what we're all gathered for. So welcome to SV2. I know we have a wide range of understanding of what SV2 is, so I'll just start with a brief introduction. We are a community of more than 200 individuals who all have come together to learn how to be more effective givers and to pool resources, both financial and otherwise, to support innovative nonprofits and promising social ventures. And our mission really is very simple, and it is to support an equitable and sustainable Bay Area where everyone thrives. So that is what I think we're here to do as well, and to learn more about. I want to start with a very basic thing, which is where the restrooms are. So through this door and to the left, and then immediately to your right. And you all know where the food and drink is, so please do help yourselves to that as you need it. Be mindful of the fact that we do have a video camera and that sound carries. So just, if you can, I think best to slip out the main door that you came in and back in. And we have a really wonderful evening in store with Morgan and Regan, and then a few other people sharing a little bit before that. So we normally at SV2 go around the room and introduce ourselves. We have a lot of people here and a little bit less time than sometimes. So if you could each just take literally a minute and turn to somebody that's close by, maybe somebody you know, maybe somebody you don't know, and share with them, with one another, what it is that brought you here and kind of where you are on your impact investing journey, which might be the very beginning. So, anyway, okay, do that, and then we'll come back. Before we jump into the main part of our evening, Sayuri Sharper, one of our longtime partners and also one of our co-leads for impact investing here at SV2, is going to just share a little bit about how we do impact investing here. Before you come up, I just want to introduce Lisa Jones, who also is a veteran co-lead of impact investing, and Arti Chadna, where is she? I know she's here, there she is. So these three women, amongst others, know a great deal about what we do. So if this piques your interest, please feel free to speak with them. So, here.
Hi everybody, welcome today. This is such a great event, and I'm very happy that I get to talk to you about what we do in the Impact Investing Working Group. By the way, I read this book. It's awesome. You guys all have copies. It's actually an easy read, and Morgan said that they tried to do it as an easy read. But there is so much information, and she shares with the reader her path through her journey through impact investing. And I just wanted to share that I got interested in impact investing about 2 years ago. And my start of my journey was here at SV2 in the Impact Investing Working Group. And that's where, at the time, I just discovered the field, and I loved it. So I went all in. So I went on the website and to see what others are doing, and I want to give a plug to GSBI because I'm a mentor there as well. So I decided that I'm going to figure out who these socialpreneurs are, what I can help with, and then if you want to invest in this field, how do you do it? So having this group at SV2 is awesome because we're all going through that journey. I would say that we're fortunate to have a leader, Tony Stater. He helped organize this event. He's been doing impact investing longer than the rest of us, so we're catching up. And then, of course, Lisa and Artie, we are fully invested in terms of our activities. We're looking for deals. We're figuring out how to balance impact with financial return. We're trying to understand how big this tent is and to learn together and to hopefully share our learning with the rest of SV2 partners. So if you want to join us, the working group is open to anybody that's an SV2 partner. The folks that is truly involved, I hate to say that we spend lots of time on this stuff, And you're welcome to go as deep as you can, do all the due diligence with us when we evaluate a company, or you can audit and get a feel and just talk to us and get your sense as to what impact investing is. So talk to Lisa, Artie, and me. We also have a good reading list for general background, but definitely also read Morgan's book. So with that, I want to turn it over to Tony.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add is that I too am a GSBI mentor. So we're straddling it, and I think Seema is here also. She's another GSBI mentor. So, I think there's just great synergy between the two groups. And I just encourage, if you're a GSBI person, to check out SV2. This idea of learning by doing is very compelling, not just on the nonprofit side, but the impact investing side. So we actually, we have live capital that we're investing in deals, SV2's money, and the money will flow back into our donor advised fund at Impact Assets. And so anyway, and then the mentoring experience is just wonderful. There's a whole curriculum there, and I got to say, it ups your game in terms of understanding social entrepreneurship, what it takes to make a successful company, and then like SV2, it's just a wonderful community of like-minded people. So anyway, that's my plug for both organizations. And with that, the GSBI Miller Center is the official co-sponsor here, so I want to introduce Mark Carenti, who's the Director of Impact Investments there.
I said, oh boy. So we've heard GSBI mentioned 2 or 3 times already. My name is Mark Carenti, and I head up impact investing at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship at Santa Clara University, which also goes by the name GSBI.
Which stands for?
Which stands for, where's Alex Limbris? Alex?
Global Social Benefit Initiative.
Institute.
Alex, I used him because I wasn't exactly sure myself. I'm just going to share in that with you. Alex heads up our mentoring program. So one of 3 reasons why we've been successful, and I'll take you through a little bit of this for just 2 or 3 minutes, is our mentors. And there are probably 8, maybe more mentors in the room tonight. In fact, let's just do this really quickly, and then I'll go a little bit about what we do at Santa Clara. So if you're a mentor GSBI, isn't that wonderful? There you go. So what's this all about? Okay, so 15 years ago, the center started doing capacity development with social enterprises. Social enterprises for us are both for-profit and non-profit, and then there's a third type, which is hybrids, which is a combination of the two. And so in that 15-year history of doing capacity development, primarily accelerator work, we do a 10-month program, very in-depth with mentors. We do a 6-month program, and we also do in-country, we'll do a 5-day, real quick, we call Boost Training Program. But we have trained over 800 social enterprises. Those 800 social enterprises have raised, since the inception of their organization, we don't want to take credit for this, have raised over $500 million, have affected over 250 million lives, and as part of the impact investing space, they want to raise, they would like to raise, that alumni group, about $150 million a year to $200 million a year going forward. So how do we effectively do that? How do we do that with scale? So that's what we're doing over at Miller Center. A couple of programs, we'll train upwards of 75 to 100 social enterprises in depth every year. We'll do this by working in country in India and doing work with energy access companies and doing funding facilitation work, helping them go out and find assets. We'll do this in sub-Saharan Africa with General Electric, doing some maternal and child health. So we do a variety of cohorts. So that's a little bit on us. If you have an interest, if you see the people in the room, you say, I want to be like them, please talk to Alex about it at the close. And then finally, just a quick comment on Morgan, because I get that opportunity too, because I'm up here. She's fabulous, phenomenal leadership in the impacting space. She has put so much time in. She's one of the early adopters She's a true practitioner with Candide, which is a family office, and working with them. She's also very much trying to build out the ecosphere, particularly with larger investors on the institutional side, with Transform Finance. She sits on the board of CARE Enterprises, so that's the impact investing arm for CARE, the INGO. The INGOs are really trying to get in, and the NGOs are really trying to get in this space. The MFIs are too, microfinance institutions. Very few are doing it well. CARE is one of two that I know that are doing it well. And we were on the phone with them going through a lot of our social enterprises actually today, over 20 of them. So she sits on the board of that. So I encourage you afterwards to kind of look deeper into her background with the book and even beyond the book and see the variety of things she's associated with, and maybe there's some things of interest for you there. So I appreciate the opportunity, and please talk to Alex afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce Morgan.
Wait, oh, Michael.
Our speakers tonight.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to read because I want to get this right and I want to make sure I get everything perfect. So Morgan Simon is a widely recognized leader in impact investment who builds bridges between finance and social justice. Over the past 17 years, she's influenced over $150 billion in capital. Simon currently co-leads the Candide Group, which supports 2 clients, including members of the Pritzker family, on behalf of Libra Foundation. She is also co-founder and chair of the nonprofit Transform Finance. Previously, Simon served as the founding CEO of Tonic, a global network of impact investors, and as the founding executive director of Responsible Endowments Coalition. She has worked with the United Nations in Honduras, in corporate reform with forest ethics, and in domestic microfinance with the Women's Initiative for Self-Employment. She currently serves on the boards of the Restaurant Opportunity Center, the Working World, and CARE Enterprises. A graduate of Swarthmore, Simon serves as an adjunct professor in Middlebury College's graduate school program, and she lives in the Bay Area. A fun fact about Morgan is that she is the 50-50 of her parents. Her mother was president of Knowledge Universe, investing in education on behalf of Mike Milken, and her father is Screamin' Scott Simon of Sha-Na-Na. One of the 2 original members still with the group 48 years later. Also, delighted that Regan Pritzker can join us. She's an elementary school teacher and mother of 3 teens. As chair of the investment committee of her family's foundation, the Libra Foundation, Regan works to accelerate alignment of the invested assets with their mission to support transformative social justice. She also serves on the boards of Global Green Grants Fund and the Urban School of San Francisco. She holds a master's degree in development education from UC Berkeley and a bachelor's degree in art history from Stanford University, and always has fun at the big game. A fun fact about Regan is that she has been known to occasionally be found singing in a parent funk band called Foxy Cleopatra. So Michael, I don't have a fun fact for you, so I'm going to cold call you on a fun fact in just a minute. So get ready for that. So, yeah. Cool. Michael Staten is a partner at Learn Capital, where he has helped lead investments in Coursera, Minerva, and Brilliant. He previously founded and was CEO of Uversity, the pioneer in social enrollment management, technology, and higher education. For Uversity, he secured the first venture investment from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's U.S. programs into a private company. Because of his years as a public school teacher and intuitive understanding of K-12 education, Michael served as a venture partner and community advisor to New Schools Venture Fund, New School Fund's Seed Fund, now Reach Capital. Outside of investing, he has held early roles at Befriended and advised many education tech companies, including Dev Bootcamp, an investee of Libra Foundation and SV2. Learner's Guild, which was the follow-on from Dev Bootcamp, and Goldbook. He was declared a top 100 innovator by the Chronicle of Higher Education, and he currently serves on the advisory board of SXS. South by Southwest. And and the Higher Education Working Group of the American Enterprise Institute.
Sure.
And I'm cold calling you on your fun fact.
My fun. I'm kind of a workaholic. I don't really have any. I like to go dancing with Morgan. Yeah, that's right. Well,
So I do want to say one thing. Michael is a friend of Morgan's, and tonight wanted to make the books complimentary. So he has funded the books for everybody, and so Michael.
Fun fact, I'm a book pusher. So I work with Learn Capital. We invest in education and learning companies. We often think that we're competing with books in the sense that we're expanding what kind of media and learning experience you can have when you want to receive ideas. That being said, a book is still kind of the primary unit of transmitting ideas. And I happen to think that Morgan's ideas are stellar pretty much all the time, especially over sushi. And so I wanted to try to, help transmit those ideas to you guys. I used to help my friends move a lot. So like whenever they had to move apartments, I would show up and help them move their bed and their couch. And as I've gotten older, people move less and they have way more furniture and they hire movers. So I'm totally useless. And now I'm lucky enough to have friends that write books, and it turns out that I can serve the same purpose by buying a bunch of books in their first week of being purchasable. So if you have any friends that are writing books, just sign up to buy a couple hundred in the first week. They will love you. Whenever I talk to family offices, high net worth individuals, there's this kind of like old stupid joke that occurs to me, which is this like prank call where you call somebody and you say, hey, do you know that your refrigerator is running, right? And it's something, whatever, it's like, well, you better go and catch it. Or is your refrigerator running? You better go and catch it, right? And I think about that, I'm like, is your portfolio creating the future of the world, right? And if so, you better go and figure out what future it's creating, right? And I know that that's not exactly, but it occurs to me, I'm like, your portfolio is creating a future. What future is it creating? Or your donor advised fund is creating a future. What future is it creating? And as I don't know Regan that well, but the thing that I admire, one of the things I admire about both of them is they think about how your portfolio expresses your values and essentially an extension of your identity. I was reading the book over the weekend, and it reminded me of this anecdote that Malcolm Gladwell had about Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, because I called Morgan and I was like, your 3 principles are so simple and elegant and succinct and easy to remember and easy to understand, and I'm so jealous and mad at you for having been able to have written that. She was like, oh, I worked on them for a year, and I was so happy because, there was this dialogue between Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan where Leonard Cohen had worked on the song Hallelujah for 3 years before he felt comfortable playing it, and he was like, Bob Dylan was like, how long did it take you? And he's like, 3 years. And then Leonard Cohen's like, oh, I really like this song that you wrote. How long did it take you? And he's like, 15 minutes. So I was really excited to have Morgan say it took her a year to write those 3 principles. But anyway, I admire both of these women because the thing that isn't in their bios is that they really live their values, right? Morgan actually disappears from the Bay Area once a year to go live in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Brazil. Every time I want to catch up with her in Oakland, we have to go to some kind of grassroots community event with disenfranchised communities, having a lot of more fun than I can have in San Francisco. So anyway, I admire both of these women, and I admire Morgan, and I'm happy to be able to transmit the ideas that Morgan has in this book. So, yeah.
Wow, this audience is
been so well warmed up. I feel like I really need to produce here, so I hope you like it. And thank you so much for having me, and it's been really wonderful to be back with the SV2 family. And the one thank you that hasn't been said yet is to Tony Stainer, who's just been a wonderful partner over the years, and thank you so much for all your efforts. Really putting the miles in here. So I'm going to talk about three things tonight. I'm going to talk about some of the history in philanthropy that led to the rise of impact investment, and what are some of the challenges in philanthropy that impact investment has the power to solve. I'm going to talk about some of the ways where impact investment is doing great and has really evolved well over the past decade, and then leave you with some challenges that I see for impact investment for the future, and opportunities to really deepen the impact we do. And then Regan is going to talk a bit about that journey in the context of her family and the foundation, and the way that they have really been able to take those values and into concrete action, and knowing that sometimes that's where you have that gap moment of, you know, what you'd like to be versus getting to that actual future state. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So let's start by talking a bit about why impact investment matters, right? For people who are thinking clearly about social change in so many different elements of their life, and seeing that clearly with all the philanthropy that's happened over the past century, we haven't solved poverty and climate change yet. Sorry, guys. And I think it's due to some fundamental flaws within the practice of philanthropy, that groups like SV2 are doing a lot to improve, but that there's still room to grow in thinking about how we kind of activate more of our resources towards justice. So the first is thinking about the fact that the revolution will not be funded. And this is actually a phrase stolen from a book. I'm wondering if this can go a little bit further down so things aren't cut off. And if not, that's totally okay. I just want to give you the most beautiful user experience possible here. So this was a book that came out around 2007 that was all the rage amongst grassroots activists who were starting to really think about what was the origins of foundations and the ways that many have been used. You get the idea. But it is important to note, I'm glad that it caught in there, edited by Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and that it was a group that was really doing very grassroots work, but that was thinking about this broader infrastructure and the way that they were struggling to do some fairly radical work within the context of philanthropy. So recognizing that a lot of historic philanthropy or philanthropic organizations had been set up to be advantageous within the tax code, and not always as interested in really upending the world order. And you see some of that reflected in what philanthropy tends to do in the world, which is that, admittedly this is probably a much better educated than most crowds, what percentage of philanthropy in the US is going towards some type of social justice cause? So as opposed to cultural organizations or universities.
5%, 3%.
Let's see. Yeah, that's the thing with people who are already clued into the fact this is a problem. It's about 12%. That's still pretty abysmal in my book in terms of the resources that you need for structural change. And a lot of grassroots organizations were looking at this and saying, you know, we really need to generate our own revenue for movements, and especially when we're doing organizing and advocacy work where you don't always have the best deliverables at the end of the year because you're building a community of practice, and that takes time. And at the end of this book, people were so excited about, we're going to start to use this in our movements, and how do we generate our own revenue? And the big suggestions they had was more bake sales and block parties, which is great, right? But you can only do so much with that, right? So there's this interest in, well, how do we generate other resources for movements, but not a lot of practical knowledge about how one might think to get there. So then the second challenge, right, that philanthropy winds up being really this drop in the bucket when you think about overall global economic activity. The numbers here are a little bit dated, but the overall proportions are still pretty accurate. That you have this massive amount of money that's moving around global capital markets every day, and then that tiny little dot in the middle, right, that's foundation giving, and maybe 4 times as much as that in individual giving, right, because that is the primary philanthropic engine in the US. But still, you are locked into this David and Goliath fight of you have this tiny, tiny piece of resources that's trying to influence the activity of a whole economy. No wonder we keep losing. And then this leads to problem 3, that you wind up fighting poverty with one arm tied behind your back, and that you're constantly kind of working at cross purposes, whether it's foundations or for individual philanthropists, and knowing that you're actively donating to a certain cause, but your investments might actually be causing the problem. And this, I would say the first time that it was really brought up in the public eye, 2001. In a series of articles from the LA Times about the Gates Foundation, which I'll note is nowadays a major leader in impact investment, but wasn't back then. And this was this great series of investigative journalism that looked at the fact that the Gates Foundation would fund over $200 million in health programs in Nigeria, largely caused by the oil companies in which they were investing twice as much, right? So if you're investing twice as much money in the problem as you are in the solution, you really can't be surprised when you're not making progress. And this series of articles, it's still very good, very relevant, has like 4 different topics, including things like funding the mortgage crisis, essentially funding the financial institutions causing the mortgage crisis, but then funding the centers for homeowners who are distressed to figure out how to get out of it, right? As opposed to just financing a better mortgage product. So I think that when people start to look at the incongruence between what their philanthropic work is doing and what their investment portfolio is doing, it starts to feel really irreconcilable, right? Or rather something that you start to feel this kind of strong personal passion of how do I make sure that 100% of my assets, not just the 5% that I give away, is really going to be working towards my goals. So impact investing came about as kind of a potential solution to this, right? The idea that it was investments that had this intention of generating some type of social and environmental return. And that intention part was very explicitly put in by the Rockefeller Foundation, which was essentially the author of this term back in 2007. And that intentionality piece is critical because it also kind of gives a nod to the fact that we don't always get it right. You know, we try to do the best we can to have this positive impact, but that you do have to then take this extra step to make sure you're kind of doing the right thing. And I wound up getting into this, as I mentioned, I've been doing it for 17 years, and you're welcome to do the math on that, which means that I started pretty young. I filed my first shareholder resolution when I was 19 years old at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. And it was that as an activist who had been interested in a broad number of issues, and while I know certainly SV2 members that may be part of a certain group, you're passionate about education, but it doesn't mean that you're against affordable housing, or we tend to have multiple loves of issues that we care about that tend to intersect in the economy at the end of the day. And I started to think a lot about, well, I could try to get fair trade coffee in the cafeteria, or I could try to get sweatshop-free shirts in the student store, but that's maybe $10,000 a year of spending. But I'm part of an institution that has $1 billion endowment, and this might be the only 4 years of my life that I'm going to be a billionaire. So why don't I take advantage of that opportunity in full and see what I can do to influence the endowment, right? So I think often we have a lot of economic power that we kind of give up, and whether it's to our financial advisor or to institutions, but really thinking about how do we engage with that power. So I'd started off working on Lockheed Martin, which at the time, back in 2002, didn't have sexual orientation as in part of their non-discrimination policy. And we managed to convince the company through resolution to also start giving domestic partner benefits to really expand their non-discrimination clause. And then afterwards, we wrote letters to 3 other Fortune 100 companies saying, hey, we've noticed you don't have this policy either. By the way, did you happen to see the front page of the Wall Street Journal? We'd be really happy to file a resolution with you too. And they all wrote back within a month saying, oops, we're sorry, we'll change your policy. And at that point I was 20, and I was pretty well convinced that this was where I wanted to spend my life, of seeing so much opportunity for action. And there was a lot of media attention at the time. It was the first shareholder resolution filed since the apartheid era, if people have been involved in South Africa divestment movement. And we started to get a lot of inquiries from students at other schools saying, this is amazing, how do we do this? How do we influence the endowment? And we started this group, the Responsible Endowments Coalition, which is on about 100 campuses across the country, working on the $400 billion that colleges and universities influence. So that's where I spent my first kind of 4 years in the field, and then was asked to start Tonic, which some of you may know. It's about 200 investors globally looking to place about $4.5 billion into impact. And as the founding CEO, over a number of years, I was looking at close to 500 deals a year and getting a really kind of broad view of what was getting counted as part of impact investment. And that started to kind of expose for me some of the challenges within the field and within the idea of impact. People may or may not know or have connected to the Merriam-Webster definition of impact, right? To impinge or make contact, especially forcefully. Doesn't always sound that good, right, to be part of the impinge upon movement, but I think it's a really relevant definition to come back to in thinking about. I think part of activism is always the idea that you have a worldview, whatever that might be, and hopefully you have some well-founded reasons for deciding to be on the certain side of any debate, and I always try to really bring a profound respect in that, right? We're all reasonable people who will come to different understandings based on different life experiences. But at the time, even when I was advocating for gay rights, I'm going to detour back into this story, I had some really loving letters written to me saying, from churches, saying, we think you're a lovely girl, we'd love to help you, will you come to our congregation, we'd love to sit with you. And they might have been on a totally opposite side of the issue, but the fact that they were willing to reach out and say, we value your perspective, we'd like to have an open dialogue around this, I found really fascinating, and made me think a lot more about how do I make sure I'm inviting people in and not just impinging upon them, right, as part of this great work. But going from there, why is this important, right, in terms of what is this impact investment thing going to be? That if you look at some of the projections from the field, if JP Morgan is anywhere near correct, $2 trillion going into the field over the next decade, that's 10 times as much as official development aid, right? So the way that a lot of countries, communities are experiencing social change funding is rapidly shifting under their feet, and most have almost no understanding or even knowledge of what is this thing called impact investment that is going to impact my community. And it begs this question really strongly of who's going to kind of influence the next decade of impact investment. What are going to be the main questions we're going to focus on? And I would posit that in the last decade, we as an industry did a really fantastic job of solving some of the main financial questions that we've had in the industry. And I imagine that these are, for some of you who are doing impact investment or aren't yet, that these are questions that we've all had to sit with because they're important to us as individuals or for institutions. So can impact investment be market rate, or am I just going to lose my money? That's a pretty important one. And I think we've seen by now study after study, from Deutsche Bank to Harvard Business Review, institutions that don't have any particular interest in trying to prove the point, that have been really strongly showing that you absolutely are able to get good, if not superior, returns. So one of my favorites from Harvard Business Review, they looked over 18 years at high sustainability and low sustainability companies. And the high sustainability cohort had 2 times the market cap and 4% annual productivity gains, like isolated to the variable of sustainability practices. In part because when you kind of get more, and sustainability including both environment and workers. So some of that being that when you treat people well, they work harder, right? This is a small but important point. And that when you treat the environment well, you buy a lot of goodwill from your consumers and from your partners. And when you look in general at business growth over time, besides the computer, there's not many things in society that have produced that much productivity gains over time, right? So I feel like we have study after study to sort of prove that first point. And there's certainly some approaches that are not going to be market rate, but that you get to have a choice, right? That you might be intentionally deciding to, I don't even like the language of give up return because it implies a certain entitlement in the first place, but where we might make a calculation that if my philanthropic dollars have a negative 100% return, if I even got 80% of that back, right, a minus 20 return, that would be phenomenal, right? Like that would be really great progress, and I would be able to recycle those resources for more philanthropic work. At any rate, I digress. Second, is it an asset class or an approach, right? So JP Morgan's first report was actually impact investment, the new asset class. And everyone in the industry rushed out to say, no, that's not right. Let's make sure we correct this in the market. And that we've now, through Tonic's 100% network, have shown close to 100 asset owners who are saying, I want this approach to my entire portfolio, and we now know that the product is out there to be able to do that. So I think that's been another really important maturation point for the field, and Regan can certainly touch on that in the context of the Libra Foundation and their decision to seek 100% within their portfolio. And then finally, can the impact industry scale, right? Is this just going to be some pet projects, or is this something that's going to have more legs? And we're seeing that it has been growing massively, right? So from 9 billion in 2013, which what's interesting is that from an investment perspective, that's a very small amount of money. From a philanthropic perspective, that would be a huge amount of money. And it's amazing how you start to get into much larger numbers once you're talking investment. We're now at the point of about 117 billion. These are once again JP Morgan and Global Impact Investor Network figures. And then beyond that, $1 in $5, right, 8.72 trillion is in some type of screen fund. And that might just be the sin stocks, right? So things like pornography was the first that popped in my head, so I'll just go with it. That's often just straight up, but I think it's more classically alcohol, tobacco, pornography, and firearms as the classic sins. But it's this kind of gateway into getting people to think about what is the impact that I want my portfolio to have. And it's just interesting to see that because these are some of the exemptions that got started in the 1600s, they sort of stayed through today, but there's no reason why in an era of climate change, in an era of mass inequality, that you couldn't have an expanded sin list that would be more applicable to modern day ales. And then the one final piece on this I wanted to show is just this quilt, to the extent you can read it. It's issues down the left, and then it's asset classes across the right. And it's just to show that regardless of the issue that you are most passionate about, there is a product within pretty much every asset class, right? So going back to that question of, is this something that can scale? Is this something that I can do across all asset classes? If I'm into something like community development, right, that I can have my cash at a community bank, that I can be putting my debt into something working on foreclosure repair. I might have some microfinance funds. I might be doing something through shareholder advocacy, right? That there's so many different ways to engage in the field that I think we've kind of solidified that point, right? That there are absolutely inroads for people who want to do impact. So if those financial questions are largely solved, I feel like the next decade has the opportunity to really focus on the impact side of that, right? To make sure that we're really balanced in our approach to impact investing. And some of the questions that I'm really focused on and have been inviting others in the industry to think about. So one is, are our investments going to just create gradual change, or are they going to create more systemic change, more transformative change? And given the depths of the crises that we've had over the last couple of decades, I feel like we don't have time anymore to stick to gradual change, that we really need to think about what systems change is and not just accept that something is social or environmental because you checked the box, right? But to really do that deeper inquiry to become a much more conscious consumer of impact investment. So for example, something like solar, is it priced in a way that's affordable to people? Is it taking land out from under people, or is it truly accepted by that particular community? Second, can we balance our skill sets between the finance and the social side? That often there's the feeling of, if you understand business and you want to do social, as long as you read the New York Times, you're going to have enough social education to be able to just jump in. And if we think about the fact that in order to be qualified as an investor, right, you might spend years within a working group, you may have gone and gotten an MBA, that there's a clear path of learnings that you have to have. We haven't developed the commensurate infrastructure for how do we get to understand what social is in the realm of impact investment. And I feel like as a community, we've been really great at creating infrastructure once we decide that that's something that needs to happen. And particularly within the philanthropic community, in thinking about, it's about investing dollars, but it's also knowing that we need to help build this sort of infrastructure. And that's where groups like Rockefeller have been very proactive in saying we need to have a grant approach that's also about infrastructure for impact investment, not just about the investing activity. And then the final question of can we, or even more importantly, how are we going to build a more inclusive industry? So when we look at the stats within private equity, just in general across the board, not even necessarily including impact, less than 4% of funds are managed by people of color, less than 1.5% by women. This is pretty sobering. And for a community of people who want to solve the world's biggest problems, we can't do that if we don't have people leading those efforts who are from those communities, who really understand those problems inside and out. And I think that's something that we understand very clearly from a for-profit mindset, that you absolutely have to have people closest to that experience to make sure that you're solving for the right problem. And that is something that we have not created in the impact investment industry. And that means that we're in danger of leaving a lot of value on the table. So that's another question that I feel is really critical as we think about, in general, who's going to set the agenda for impact investment? And is it going to be accountable to the communities that we're serving, or is it going to happen from the 40th floor of a bank in Manhattan? And I want that banker on the 40th floor involved, right? I want his or her, usually his, but his or her financial expertise in the room. I just want to make sure that they are paired with someone who has that grassroots social experience to make sure that we're really doing the best work that we can. And I want to tell a story about what happens when you fail, right? What are we at danger of? And I would posit that it's not just danger of not fulfilling our social mission, but that it can have disastrous financial results as well. So I'm going to tell a story of impact investment gone wrong, and then a couple of impact investments gone right, to show that there is opportunities to do things in a way that can really be systemically transformative. So I want to take us to the south of Mexico, to a state called Oaxaca, which has some of the best wind reserves in the world. And the Mexican government, along with some development institutions, impact investors, and corporate partners, wanted to launch Latin America's largest wind farm, an incredible opportunity to provide renewable energy to a country that's very fossil fuel dependent, to look at economic development within an indigenous region. And then create fantastic financial return, right? You can often get 20% returns on wind. So this is the type of thing, if I'm sitting at my desk, even on the third story of an office in Oakland, not as bad as the 40th floor, but still not sitting in rural Oaxaca, I would get that project on my desk and I'd be pretty excited, right? It ticks all the boxes that we would want. And it did sound good for everyone, except of course for the people who lived there, if you took the time to ask them. So this is some of the village members from the Istmo de Tehuantepec. Their sign says, "Transnationals, get out of the country. We are completely against the wind corridor." And it was that this is a predominantly Zapoteco-speaking community, indigenous community. They were asked to sign contracts in Spanish, didn't know what they were signing half the time. Realized later on that they basically had 12,000 hectares of land taken under their noses for $50 a hectare, which is, when you think about $550 million invested in a project with an expected return of 20%, and all you could give was 50. But that was perceived to be enough because it was better than what people had before, right? So this goes back to gradual change is often about making people better off, but not thinking about what's fair, right? Of how do we really go back to what's fair in a particular situation. And the villagers, ascertaining that this was not fair, started putting up roadblocks and having some pretty violent altercations with the police. 9 people were shot, to the point where they wound up putting out this statement: to stop the intimidation, hostility, and violence, not associated with terrorism, not associated even with fossil fuels, but with wind energy, right? And with impact investors. And these are 3 words that I certainly never want associated with my investment practice. And it happened, right, because people didn't take the time to make sure that they were actually accountable to the communities that they were supposed to be serving. And this story to me reflects some broader trends that I've been seeing in impact investment. That often investors and entrepreneurs are profiting not alongside with communities, but at the expense of communities, right? In focusing on solutions that are a little better without structuring them to be fully fair. And that impact gets defined by the investors, right, in terms of their project plan, as opposed to making sure to check in on what is the impact that those grassroots partners want to see. And part of why this happens is that there's a major capital gap for more community-led projects. That those who are angels in the room, right, or are familiar with the category of friends and family, You have to be pretty lucky in this world. If your friend and family, they may love you very much, but are not going to have $50,000 to provide startup capital, right? So how do we create a more equitable playing field for people who didn't go to business school and are not going to have access to business plan competitions or don't have access to your family, to really create a much more inclusive industry? Part of that is really thinking about the on-ramps to it. So I had, at that point, I'd been running Tonic for about 4 years. I was thinking deeply about these challenges and how I wanted to solve them, and there were 2 main pathways that I took from there. So the first was founding a nonprofit organization called Transform Finance, which is building a bridge between finance and social justice. And there's 2 main activities that we do. We host an investor network, which launched at the White House in 2014. It was a different time back then. And now has about $2 billion between the different members who are committed explicitly to a social justice agenda, who get together on a monthly call to explore different issues, specific deal flow, to learn from grassroots partners and kind of be active members of that conversation. And that is something that is open to people in this room. And then in building a bridge from both sides, the other work that we do is with community leaders, nonprofit leaders, grassroots leaders who may have heard something about impact investment, who read The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, were not excited about the bake sale option, and wanted to learn about more concrete strategies for revenue development, or like the community in Oaxaca, want to learn more about how do I hold investors accountable for their work. And those trainings have been 80% people of color in the US, and then we've done work in Haiti and Mexico, a couple other countries in there. But it's been great to really see the opportunity to broaden who's getting to be part of these conversations. So that was the organizing work that I wanted to see happen. In that case, I was the co-founder, and then passed it off to a wonderful executive director, Andrea Armeni, who's in New York. And I really wanted to spend my time doing the investing, because I think the other piece that's critical, it's one thing to have fantastic values and to spout them out to everyone you know, but to be able to show, yes, we did that with a portfolio. You know, this is something that actually is implementable as a strategy, that we're able to hit our return targets, we're able to be realistic in what we do. And started Candide Group about 4 years ago, myself and a business partner out of Oakland, where we work with 2 clients to do 100% approach to impact, very much along the lines of these principles of social justice. And Libra Foundation is obviously one of those clients. We're excited to share that journey. I'll note we are not accepting other clients, so it's very easy to follow the no pitch rule at SV2. We have nothing to sell, and that's part of why we're really happy to try to serve as a fairly impartial resource. We're happy to certainly provide suggestions and to talk to people about their practice, but really as much as possible just in a way that supports them in the field. So with that, in terms of our work and how do we think when we're looking at a full portfolio, and where do you start in wanting to have more of a social justice thesis? And there's 3 main principles that we use that we try to apply across the portfolio. And I'm going to give an example of a project in each of those categories. And I guess that not all of which that we have an investment relationship with, but more to just give you an example. And in all these cases, in every example, just for educational purposes. So the first principle, I want to go back to that community in Oaxaca, where a number of the community members came together and said, okay, we get it. It's not that we're against wind energy. We just don't like the idea of people taking our land and taking all the economic benefit. And we recognize that we do have this very valuable resource of wind. How could we monetize it ourselves, right? How could we start our own wind farm? And they managed to connect with the head of the Global Wind Commission, who happened to be Mexican and Spanish, and started an enterprise called Grupo Yansa, or Yansa Group in English, which has been working with that community to develop their own wind farm. So what does that take? It takes about $60 million, not a small project. But it goes back to, and what I really love about the founders' thinking is saying, let's change the whole infrastructure, right? Rather than just doing a couple small projects, let's really look at what's going to have transformative impact for this community. And one of the first things that the community voted on was how do they want to use the proceeds from this? And their decision was to create a pension fund for the elders. So some people may know California is sometimes called Baja California. in Mexican communities because there's more Oaxacans living in California than actually in Oaxaca. Migration is such a huge thing. And oftentimes, it's not because people necessarily want to, right? I think sometimes there's this kind of in the immigrant narrative of the assumption that everyone came because they really wanted to be in the US. Often it's that they needed to support someone back home and are dying to get back home as soon as they can. And in this particular community, they wanted to create a pension fund for the elders so that the young people wouldn't have to migrate, so that they would know that their grandparents were taken care of, and then the young people could have more flexibility in how they live their lives, right? That's a very different type of financial return. And at the same time, they could still, with such a structure, be able to create market rate debt returns, but just not give up the equity, right? Not give up the ownership of the project. So this is something that's in process. They've been in pretty heavy negotiation with the Mexican government on some pieces, but from a planning perspective, kind of gives a sense of how could you have done something differently. And the final thing I should note, if this wasn't already obvious, that community did stop the project. And I think sometimes that can be seen as a victory in the landscape of grassroots organizing, but it's really a massive failure, right? It means, one, investors lost hundreds of millions, two, that Mexico didn't get this renewable energy source, and the community didn't get the economic development they could have had, right? So I think trying to make this less of a zero-sum game, but looking at how can you create these win-wins, right? So it doesn't mean that you can't profit off of social investments. That's sometimes a critique of, well, I don't want to make money off of poor people. You can make money alongside people, right? That is absolutely fine, and especially in a context where you're going to go ahead and recycle that money within another community. So going back to the principle that we often look at, engaging communities in design, governance, and ownership, that it's not just selling things to people or using them as a workforce, but actually viewing communities as protagonists is a very big shift in the landscape of social enterprise. The second principle we think a lot about is adding more value than we extract, right? So this goes back to not just doing things that are better, but really thinking about what makes something fair. And in the context of social investing, as much as possible, we want that consumer or owner or worker to receive the majority of the benefit, right? If I'm calling someone a beneficiary, they should benefit more than I do. And as the investor in the relationship, they likely have less than I have to start out. So the example here is a debt fund called the Working World out of New York, and the 17 members that you see here are the New Era Windows and Doors Cooperative. And this was a factory in Chicago, a sustainable window factory, that was profitable, but the owner, because they had several diverse business interests, wanted to sell it off to go do other things, which would have put all these people out of work. They wound up occupying the factory. Obama came out and spoke. It was a very kind of high media effort for a while. And ultimately, the workers offered to buy out the founder of the company and managed to create, it's now the only minority-owned manufacturing facility in the entire state of Illinois. And it now has 17 worker owners, right, which is a really critical part as well when we think about economic development in the US, right? So in terms of wage disparity, black men make 80 cents on the dollar to white men. That's abysmal. But the fact that their families have 22 times less assets, right, is the much deeper, harder to address problem. So even if you had wage parity, if you don't address ownership, 200 years from now, you're going to be in the exact same place in terms of inequality. So that's where things like worker co-ops create this opportunity to not just create one owner out of this picture, which is what would be a little more typical, but to create 17 owners. And this guy in the black shirt there is Brendan Martin. He's the founder of the fund and has been now supporting dozens of co-ops across the US. And the one other thing I should note in terms of the add more value than you extract, part of what they pioneered was this idea of a non-extractive investment structure. That rather than traditional debt, which says if you mess up and aren't profitable, I'm taking your machine away, right? I'm taking your assets. They function much more like an equity partner that says, I want to succeed with you. I'm only going to take my money back if you succeed, right? I make sure that you're getting paid first, and then that aligns everybody's interests, right, to want to succeed. So they had actually started in Argentina and then migrated to the US, which is another interesting feature of them. But over 1,000 loans, 98% repayment rate under that model, right? So people do not take the money and run. If they are aligned with you, they perform. And they do great things for their families and for investors at the same time. And then the final principle that we try to operate by is balancing risk and return between investors, entrepreneurs, and communities. And this goes back to thinking about sometimes as investors, we're really eager to lower our risk. That absolutely makes sense. But I also have to acknowledge the risks that community members may be taking on in terms of their contributions, and therefore how do they get rewarded for their participation. And one of the enterprises that we love from this perspective is a group called Uncommon Cacao. If anyone in the Bay Area has ever had dandelion chocolate or Raka or Taza or some of these artisanal bars, this is kind of the Intel inside, which is the cacao that creates the amazing direct bar, cacao to bar experience. And what they found was that in terms of the fair trade market for cacao, you would often get something like 2 cents additional a kilo for being part of the fair trade system for a bar that would then sell, for $11.99 on the shelf, right? And what Uncommon Cacao started doing was creating a margin cap to ensure that 51% of the value of any transaction had to go back to the farmers, which is a radical shift within the industry that also motivates farmers to produce higher quality cacao. So it wound up being this sort of virtuous circle of being able to sell at higher prices, provide more value to the farmers, and really balance out the reward element of that. And as part of that margin cap, if when they're selling to chocolatiers they happen to accidentally make too much money, there's a farmer fund that then takes a piece of that revenue share, and that farmer fund is also a part owner of the company. Because the other thing the founder didn't want in terms of the risks that these farmers took on to grow the company, that if someday there's a fantastic exit, what are the farmers going to get, right? Or when you look at a company like Blue Bottle that just sold a good portion of it, $740 million to Nestle, how much of that value went to the coffee farmers globally, right? And if that's not pre-engineered, how is that actually going to happen, right? And that's something that has to be embedded really early in a company's DNA. So we're often looking at what is it in a company's structure that they're thoughtfully balancing the risk and return between these different parties. And what I also really love about those structural innovations is that rather than kind of having to do the annual impact survey and a feeling of there's like a lot of paperwork to do, is that I just know that every time a sale is made, the majority of the value went to the farmer. I don't have to worry about it, right? I can certainly sort of audit it in terms of the financials, but it's fairly simple and straightforward to be able to follow on a consistent basis. So these are just 3 of the stories of specific enterprises. In the book, I get much more specific in terms of how we took a client from 0 to now 88% impact, and sort of what cross-portfolio approaches to this could look like. And I basically wrote that book knowing that there's a lot of people who are kind of on the early end of that journey and looking for concrete ways to dive in. And I really hope that it supports you in your journey. So thank you so much for having me tonight. And I want to turn the mic over to Regan to share some of the great work that they've been doing from a practical basis.
Let's clap. Good to chat. So this is where you guys get to all be super jealous because I get to hang out with Morgan every week. Yeah. So my name is Regan Pritzker. I'm on the board of a family foundation called the Libra Foundation, which has been making grants to amazing nonprofit partners for 14 years in areas like women's health and reproductive rights, environmental justice, social justice and drug policy reform, criminal justice reform. And I have to give credit to my mom because when we first started the foundation, my parents started the foundation and invited my brothers and myself to be part of that board and that process, even though my youngest brother at the time was like 15. That's how they roll. She was interested in this concept of aligned investing or mission-oriented investing, but we really didn't know what it was, and none of us, even including my dad, who was this big businessman, really hadn't done investing as a thing because he was an operator and not an investor and had never had like personal capital. It was all family money. And so it was in our investment policy statement. I discovered that 10 years later when I actually read it. So that was super interesting. I didn't know, but my mom had been thinking about that from the beginning and knew that that was something that was going to be relevant. So fast forward 10 years later, we had a little more information about what
grant making was about. I had developed relationships with incredible movement partners and activists who were, doing great work from the nonprofit kind of orientation, but saw the world kind of going to, on this downward spiral, right, of increased wealth inequality, increased climate disaster. Right now I feel like it's almost hard to have any conversation without acknowledging all the things that are happening just in the last few months around climate. And it just felt like the pace of our sort of palliative Band-Aid work was just not up to par. So I, got inspired by some other women friends who'd been more active on the impact investing side and wanted to learn more about how we could similarly activate the full portfolio of the Libra Foundation for in this way. And so we kind of started to go on this path of shifting the conversation from, which nonprofit is doing the best work to like, what are the social problems out there and how are all the different ways that we can solve them? And I think, everyone is in a different place in sort of what their starting point is, but for me, what ended up being really helpful was just reaching out to others who, coming to something like this is just such a great way to start building that conversation. Morgan's book is an amazing introduction, and not just introduction, because I think I'll just give credit that Morgan, when we kind of first connected, it was my dream that Morgan would help the Libra Foundation to do a better job in its impact investing because of her expertise and her sort of just reputation in the field. And I spoke to some other, mutual acquaintances who talked about her being a leader in the future of impact investing. And she's really been a leader in the future, kind of setting the tone for the future of impact investing for 17 years, which is kind of cool. Like she's still at the forefront. And I think that's one of the really big lessons that we have tried to put into play at the Libra Foundation is that, every time we try something new, we're iterating to our next best self. And that I was really nervous. I have no background in investing. In fact, my husband used to tease me because anytime we'd even sit down with like our money managers who were like telling us how much money we had was supposed to be good, I would have this yawn reflex. I really did. I really hated it. And a part of it was actually a deeper psychological relationship to money, I think. Now I look back and think I was uncomfortable also, in addition to just being not interested. I just felt like having grown up in a family with a lot of money, although we didn't live in a very ostentatious way. My parents are hippies and really groovy, but I kind of had a sense that we had more, and that was connected to this reality that I also saw outside in the world, which is that other people had less. And as those statistics have just gotten worse and worse, that has been part of my my personal development towards leaning into those uncomfortable realities and kind of outing myself as a Pritzker or whatever, and not being head in the sand about it. So there's sort of that uncomfortable and I don't know anything barrier, but the more that I reached out to other resources and experts and a community of, we kind of developed a community of practice we as a foundation and me, myself personally, as kind of an advocate for this work within our foundation, got more comfortable saying well, we're just gonna try some stuff and see how it goes. And the try some stuff, if you're looking at your public equity side of the portfolio, can be kind of quick. And you're oh, every quarter I get a report, and we outperformed the public equity managers that the family was invested in with, their non-foundation investment resources. So that was a pretty quick feedback loop that this is safe water, we should all dive in. And then some of the experiment, take risks is gonna be a 10, 20, 30-year experiment. And I think the lesson that I've learned over the past 4 years of kind of engaging in this work more actively is how exciting that is to just let go of those, get over those barriers, the personal barriers, and also the kind of knowledge barriers, and then the risk tolerance barriers, and just get out there and try some stuff. And it's a balm to the soul to just feel like you're, engaging more of the tools in the toolbox towards building this future that we just don't have a lot of other options, you know, like we're on a total collision course in my mind. And I was speaking with another audience member earlier about, and I thought when the mortgage crisis hit, it would be like, okay, Wall Street's gonna figure this out, because there's like some smart people over there, and they're gonna be like, oh my gosh, our entire financial system is completely untenable and unsustainable. Did that happen? No, like we're still here trying to talk about some of the, you know, what to me are these really basic like logic problems of our, you know, the assumption we have of, you know, unlimited growth and unlimited resources and unlimited ability to exploit other people. And, you know, I think we're both here saying like, that's not okay with us. And I think you're all here because you agree that that's not okay. And we all just need to kind of keep doing everything we can to speed up that rate of building that new economy and that new world that's sustainable and regenerative and fair. Just be nice. It's not that complicated in a way, but then it is kind of complicated too.
And now you read investment memos with glee. Right?
Now, do I yawn at meetings? It helps that she brings chocolate sometimes. But truthfully, it's really joyful to feel like part of just engaging that many more resources towards the purpose. And there's a whole other long story about family dynamics and the education that has been possible. And I guess what's universal is the idea that if you take one step forward and you bring people with you, then you're having an exponential impact as well. You know, just kind of being willing to try it and then talk about it is a really powerful has a multiplier effect. It's really awesome. And I have people now, I get to be that mentor that others were for me, which is a really gratifying thing. And that's somebody, again, with no experience in investing and no inclination towards investing, and just kind of coming from a place of, we gotta do more, how do we do it? Morgan, teach me.
And all the ways we teach each other. Maybe, and then we'll happily turn it over to the audience for questions. Talk about one of your favorite investments that you've been able to make so far.
Oh, wow.
Put you on the spot.
Well, I'm a big fan of the working world. That's, actually all of your examples are incredible. Let me think about maybe a different one. I'm kind of drawing a blank. Let me talk a little bit about the working world, actually, if you don't mind. It's a repetition, but I think it's a good example of how we approach the, like, there's a problem that needs to be solved. What are the tools in our toolkit to help solve it? Because we first met Brendan, I think, at around the same time that we met, actually. I think actually we met, I can't remember if that was 3 or not. Anyway, the first financial transactional relationship we had with them was a grant to support, some of the infrastructure work and the trainings that they do, because they are, providing all kinds of services and capacity to all the different cooperative businesses that they support. Sometimes it's support to help a group even understand what it would take to go through a worker-owner, what's the word they use? Conversion. And sometimes it's, we're up and running, but, we need help with our books or whatever. So we thought that was really great. And I guess to backpedal a little bit, one of the things that surprised me through this journey to doing more of the impact investing was how that work and that practice influenced our grant making. Mm-hmm. So we hadn't really thought about economic justice as like a program area or as a theme in our grant making, but it became really clear that that's an issue that's connected across all of the things we do. And so we have developed a really interesting group of grantee partners who are working now on transformative economies, including transform finance, the working world, and folks like that. But what's cool about the working world is, at the same time as we see them as a totally worthy grantee, we can, invest X dollars as a grant that we don't expect to get back, and then to be able to invest 10x those dollars into their loan fund with an expectation of, a modest return with a very patient kind of timeline around it. But knowing that every dollar that's in that fund is at work and it's itself going through a recycling process of supporting the businesses that they partner with. So that model is kind of my favorite. We have similar projects with like Shared Interest, which is a group that works in South Africa. Jansa's in that category too, of folks that are like so on the cutting edge that they're building it as they go. And often if you're looking for this kind of mutual benefit, I mean, we do make equity investments obviously, but the sort of patient loan model with a grant is a really nice combination for a group that's sort of developing its model.
Well, you can see I'm also extremely lucky. So thank you so much for being here tonight and for all of our work together. So let's take a couple questions from the room, and I'll look to SV2's guidance for how long you'd like us to go for. Let's start with a couple. And then say never stand between people and their wine. Daniel, and then please say your name as part of the community building.
And we'll ask you to repeat the question.
Sure.
Sure. Hey, I'm Daniel, and I just had a question about the Jansa example, and how you said that because of the, I guess you said that, I just wasn't sure if it meant that if the deal went through and it would have been better. I heard you say that it was not a good deal as it was structured.
Right.
Because nobody won in some way, or especially the communities. But I just wondered if that it just went through, that if that was even worse in some way.
So I think it goes back to, so the question, and I'll try to repeat this as best as possible, of the Jansa deal, right, in terms of the wind farm. Would it have been a good thing if it gone through?
Would it have done? Would have the? I guess I'm just trying to measure impact. And just
Right.
Was that
So I think it's that there was a version of that which would have had a price tag of more than $50 a hectare. Right? There was a version of that would have maybe known about that local desire for a pension fund and structured that into the return. There was a version of that would have known that there's certain areas that they really hold sacred as a burial ground and another for cattle grazing, and you could have just excluded that 30 hectares from the site, right? So there's some small and fairly inexpensive tweaks they could have done in the context of the overall project that I think would have absolutely aligned interests. And that's where the idea of add more value than you extract, it doesn't mean don't make profit. Right? It's make sure the primary beneficiary is the community that you're trying to serve, and then secondarily take your return, right? So that's where in the current structure that they're exploring, that you could provide market rate on the debt, but keep the equity in the community. Sorry, I'll unjargon that, if that's helpful. That basically what's been interesting in terms of how they want to structure this deal, it's that the Mexican government gives these guaranteed purchasing contracts, right, that they'll buy 10 years of energy at a fixed price. And then that's how investors can feel comfortable of, I'm going to put in the money, Siemens or some reputable company is going to put in the wind turbines. I can feel pretty good that it's going to be executed in a way that's effective. Now, the thing that held them back more than anything, to be able to bid on that contract, you had to show that you had $10 million in the bank already. And this community, the other thing, there's been communal land ownership since 1917, since the Mexican Revolution, which is part of why they have amazing governance systems, right? They've got 100 years of experience in this, more than that if you go back before the formation of the government. But when you have communal property ownership, you can't use that as collateral, right? Because there's no owner to sign on the dotted line. So all of a sudden you have a community that if they could get the money in the bank to be able to get the contract, to be able to get the financing, right, like you could make that happen. And it goes back to that capital gap, right, for grassroots communities, and that now Jansa has had to put most of its work, which is needed to be funded, understandably, philanthropically at this phase, into lobbying the government to change that requirement, to say that you are categorically excluding indigenous communities who don't have $10 million in the bank, who can't use their land as collateral. And that also goes back to, you know, even fund managers in the US, right? The idea that you have to contribute 1% of your fund as the manager to start in. if I am not independently wealthy, which a good number of women and people of color may fall into that category, how am I supposed to start my fund, right? Where am I supposed to get that from? So I think these are the sorts of things that sometimes people use the term systemic bias, where I think that's the right term. Darren, who is an expert on this stuff, can correct me if I'm wrong.
Sounds good.
Okay. Rules that are designed to be neutral, right? That you would say there's nothing race or gender noted in that statement. 1% of capital has to come from the GP. But the way that that rule gets exercised, right, will have these consequences that manifest in a very race and gender non-neutral way. So I think that's what we're seeing, that the rules of some of these games have been systemically created in a way to not serve grassroots communities. And that's what we're trying to shift. We can certainly talk more about it because there's a lot to unpack.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that? That's really helpful to hear. I really appreciate that. And I'm wondering if there's a way to resolve that without going through the government and lobbying. Is there a way to do it from the philanthropic realm or through investing or otherwise?
Yeah, so it goes, that's a great question. So Daniel's question was, could you do that philanthropically? Do you need to go through the government? And now we choke up against the question of investor expectations with regards to risk and return, right? So some investors would say, if I don't have that guaranteed purchasing contract from the government, I don't want to finance this. Now, and if I am a pension fund that needs to ensure that teachers can retire, I have a grant portfolio, I need to make sure I can pay out that 5% a year, there are lots of really ethical reasons to make money, right? So I think it's important to affirm that. And at the same time, we might, in certain cases, because we want to see something happen in a way the world hasn't seen yet, and I'd say that we manage parts of the portfolio explicitly towards that objective, we're going to say, you know what, there's outsized impact potential here to change a system. I should be okay with taking on outside risk. And you know what, I actually have to make space in my portfolio for that, because otherwise, if you look at, I'll go back to that systemic bias piece. There's often a lot of hesitancy to invest in first-time fund managers, right? The idea that they don't have the same level of experience. There's some financial institutions that will not put their clients into any fund that doesn't have 3 years of investment experience and that team has worked together for 5. That is a great way to systemically exclude the majority of funds run by women and people of color, right? So we very explicitly said, okay, there might be times when and the one other thing I'll say is that a lot of data has proved that first-time funds tend to outperform the market, but neither here nor there. We explicitly have a space within our allocation to say, we think that's an important part of the market, we're gonna do it. And that similarly, we want to make sure that if we're looking at products at 7, 8, and 10%, we don't always have to choose the 10% just because it's the most, right? I think sometimes we try to really focus on what's a realistic return, what's a return that I need, whether it's for my family or my institution, rather than just constantly thinking about maximizing, right? Like, what are you trying to maximize? And I think the other, right, that Regan spoke to thoughtfully is if I'm maximizing at someone else's expense, do I really feel good about that? Like, is that how I want to pay for my kids' education? So at any rate, these are the things, if you get me going, I'll talk about. So let's take that back there.
Linda Sheehan, I'm with the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. I've read the book, it's great. I really like the 3 principles, and I'm curious, the focus is very much on social justice, which is great. I really like your examples and how they work in the world. But I'm coming at it from a more of environmental perspective, and have you done some thinking about how these 3 principles might work when you're trying to improve the well-being of the natural world as opposed to, which of course we're all connected to, et cetera, but you know what I mean, the environment specifically.
So one in Solar Holler in West Virginia, which is training former coal miners to become solar installers. And they're a small company, but their influence in the media has been huge, right? So that's been really interesting in kind of those linchpin moments in debates. I think there is, there could be a much more ecologically focused, kind of the biomimicry elements of it. I think I have trouble kind of seeing environment separate from people in that same way, so that's tended to be my entry point. But I think the general thesis around gradual versus systemic change is huge in the context of climate change, and also in the re-envisioning of finance. So I've been spent a lot of today co-authoring an op-ed with a Haitian woman talking about relief efforts, right, and how $3 billion later in Haiti, there's still 85,000 people living in tents, and the lack of investment in the long-term future, and how do we think about Puerto Rico in a very different light. You know, if you applied those 3 principles to environment, you would have much better insight than me on like how to do that, right? So my hope, and part of centering the book on questions, not on answers, was to say, let's look at these questions together, right? And then everyone gets to contribute their unique expertise into the future of impact investment. So thank you for that. Let's take one more.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I was just curious, you started to get into this, but I was just curious what your view is of the role of philanthropy in the ideal future. Is it, you know, how do you think about that? And that's for both of you, I guess.
Okay, how controversial can I be? Can I go there?
Go for it.
I think of like the best job I could do as a trustee of a foundation would be to put myself out of work. I really admire folks who are thinking about their spend down plans. It's an active debate and a worthy debate, because of course if we're like all the cool groovy progressive foundations are like, we're going to give it all away, and they don't do it in a way that actually meaningfully empowers the communities where those resources are going in ways that creates permanent power and really shifts the imbalance, then you know the fear is that the conservative foundations that held on to their capital would like win the day or whatever. But I think that the devil's in that detail of how are you investing or giving your resources in ways that are creating deep, connected, and this is an ecological principle, and this is why I think the social justice and the ecological are so intertwined in our thinking, is that you know the social ecosystem that's going to be necessary to create resilient communities and resilient environments is going to require a shift of voice to more localized and more of the sort of frontline and impacted communities. And so I that's my hope. And I think that getting out of our own way is a good step in that direction, both in terms of like Morgan referenced the sort of expectation that we have that we're giving something up or we're somehow divinely entitled to these resources. I mean, maybe it's easy for me to say because I didn't make the money, I inherited it, and I felt almost like it happened to me in a way that was not, I was impacted by it in ways that I've certainly benefited from, and I'm like very grateful for, you know, the life that I've gotten to live. At the same time, you know, it's anyway, there's a dissonance there too. So I think the idea of just a transformative view of like, you know, that I think Martin Luther King has this amazing quote, and you can look it up because I'm going to completely destroy it, but philanthropy is great except for the fact that it is a symptom, like it is a condition of a dysfunctional society, you know. So we need to not hold on so hard to those resources, whether they're your personal investments. I think, you know, we really only live once, and, you know, I'm into this idea of like flow, and if we can all practice like what it looks like to not hold on so tightly to your rules and your guidelines and what your lawyer said and what your investment manager said, and just kind of follow your heart and do what feels right and gives you joy and shares that joy with others, then we can start moving in the right direction.
I think we should end there.
I really want to thank you both and Michael for being here. And I mean, I think the conversation really begins here. And so we all have the book. Gracious enough to stick around afterwards and sign it. There's dessert. We have a couple of thank you gifts for you. And what I would just say is I mean, you know, by virtue of being here, you probably know more about this than the average person at this point. So read the book, talk about it, let your partner read it, give it to a friend, because this is really about building this. And if we're going to transform this thing, it's got to happen beyond this room. And so let's all go out and do our share. And thank you so much for getting your voices into this and perspectives. It's just so beneficial. And I too have read the book. It's a quick, easy read. It's provocative. I was interacting with it. What about this? What about that? And the other thing is I came away inspired. I want to do more. And so, go get them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I do relatively soon have to get home to a house guest, but my website and email is in the back flap. So you absolutely can't miss me, and I do personally answer that email account.
So thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks to both of you, and Michael, wherever you are. We will give you a book too. Thank you. You deserve one. So we do have other events coming up at SV2, and if anyone's interested in learning more about joining us, joining our community, let me know, or let anyone who is an SV2 person, which are many. So thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, and thanks to Tony again. Making this happen.